Hi all, this is Justin calling in from New York, and I'm going to present my proposal of the Great Lakes Greenbelt, revitalizing America's post-industrial cities through the resettlement of environmental migrants. Starting from the premise that climate change is accelerating, the human climate niche, which is the portion of the Earth's surface that experiences the optimal climate conditions for human life, is shifting. When we look at the current suitability for human life as mapped out across all of the Earth's land surface, based on a study by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we can see where on the land surface is most suitable for human life and where is least. So the green here represents the areas of highest suitability, and the white represent the areas of lowest suitability. And the orange boundary represents what we're going to refer to from here on out as the human climate niche, the area of the Earth's surface experiencing the optimal conditions for human life. This is showing the current conditions as of 2019. And here we can see large portions of Europe, United States, China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, portions of South America, where there's already currently a large number of people living, prospering. Obviously, there are people living outside of this niche, but these are the conditions that are most optimal. But taking that study and projecting it out over 50 years, scientists have shown, based on different projections of climate change, based on different emissions and adaptation and mitigation that occur, that within the next 50 years, that suitability is going to change significantly, that the climate niche itself will shift. And here with RCP 2.6, which is a lower projection of change, we can see already that it has shifted fairly significantly. Moving forward to RCP 4.5, which is a more moderate projection, and the shift is even more dramatic. But when we look at RCP 8.5, which is a more high-level model of the projected changes as a result of climate change, and we can see that this is a dramatic redistribution of where on the Earth's surface is best suited for human life. But what I think is often forgotten is that the portion of the Earth's surface that is suitable for human life is not necessarily shrinking. It is moving, it is migrating itself. But importantly, as you can see here, we have also the international borders that define our nation states. And those do not shift or change with changing environmental conditions. And so you have this two sets of conditions, one stable and stationary, and the other quite dynamic and moving fairly significantly over the next 50 years. And there we have some challenges that will arise. At present, only less than 1% of the world's land area experiences average annual temperatures above 29 degrees Celsius. And of these conditions, they're mostly confined to the Sahara Desert. By 2070, though, as much as 19%, nearly 20% of the world's land area may become uninhabitable due to extreme heat. So within the next 50 years, as much as a third of the global population, projected to be closer to 3.5 billion at that point, could be affected by these changes. And so we look at the change in suitability from 2019 to 2070 with the highest RCP 8.5 projection, and we can see that while there are large portions of the Earth's surface that will see a change in suitability for the worse, that's the orange portions, and importantly, some of those areas that will see dramatic changes for the worse are in areas that are highly populated. Most notably here you have India and China, which together hold nearly a third of the world's population, and much of that land area is going to see a very significant shift for the negative. But at the same time, we have large portions of the northern hemisphere seeing improvement in suitability over that period of time. So much of Europe, much of the northern part of the United States, Canada, even some portions of the southern hemisphere, in the southern tip of Africa, part of South America, part of Australia. But most significantly is the northern hemisphere here that will see a change for the positive. So that means that the effects of climate change will be experienced very differently across the Earth's surface, and the borders that define our nation states will have a dramatic effect on who experiences these changes and who benefits and who um, is affected in a negative way. So, as a result of these changes, billions of people may be left living outside of the human climate niche. Unfortunately, as mentioned previously, the rigidity of the modern nation-state regime, the international borders that define it, and the resulting limits on any universal freedom of movement severely restrict the most natural mechanism that humans have for adapting to the effects of climate change. And that is, of course, migration. Migration is the most natural and important mechanism or strategy that any organism on the surface of the earth has for adapting to changing conditions, whether they be environmental or otherwise. But over the history of the world and life on this planet, migration has always been one of the key ways that any organism responds to changing conditions. It moves in search of improved conditions or conditions more similar to the conditions that it was previously used to. So in that sense, mobility is resilience. The ability to move, the freedom to move across the Earth's surface in search of those improved conditions is resilience. But we have severely limited that mobility. We've severely limited the freedom of movement of all human inhabitants of the Earth. And so we've, as an international community, severely limited that resilience and that ability to adapt. So what does this mean, and what will be the effects on the global population? So here we have current and projected scale of global displacement and migration from 2020 to 2050. Across the top row here, we have the current population of nearly 8 billion people. And to get a sense of the kind of displacement or migration that currently exists in the world, we know that about 250 million people are currently living outside of the country of origin. Many of those are living outside of the country of origin by choice. Many may have legally migrated to another country with a visa or a residency permit. And so some portion of this is not a problem. But when we look at the 82.4 million, then that is the current scale of forced displacement. And those are all those people that are living outside of where they were born as a result of some negative impact or force, whether it be conflict or persecution. And then we look to 26.4 million, and that's the current number of registered refugees as of the end of 2020. And we already know just how big of an impact that number has had on global politics, on international relations, on creating humanitarian crises across the world. And that number is fairly significant, but it's relatively small in relation to the overall global population. So fast forward to 2050, and we project that the global population will be closer to 10 billion people. And then the three circles to the right, we show three varying projections on the scale of environmental migration. And at the lower end, all the way on the right, we have up to 25 million projected to be on the move as a result of climate change alone. It's important to note that these numbers are separate from any other form of displacement or migration. So this does not include those living outside of their country by choice. This does not include any refugees as would be currently covered under the Refugee Convention, and any refugees or displaced person that would be currently protected under existing international agreements or frameworks. And so that would mean, just on the low end, an additional 25 million on top of the 26.4 refugees. So nearly doubling just the number of quote unquote refugees if we refer to environmental migrants in a similar language. And that's the lowest end. That is the sort of minimum expected number to be on the move as a result of climate change. And then at the medium projection, we're up to 200 million, and that's closer to the scale of those living outside of their country of origin at the moment. And it's a much more significant number. That would be significantly greater than current scale of forced displacement or registered refugees. But then we look to the higher end projection, and many estimate that as many as 1 billion people may be on the move as a result of climate change by the year 2050. That's only 30 years from now. And that would mean at that point in time that nearly 1 in 10 people may be on the move as a result of climate change. And the scale of that kind of displacement is completely beyond our imagination. And we have really no plan as an international community to respond to that kind of displacement. And so while this is generally seen as an impossible problem, could it be reframed as an opportunity? Some of the world's countries seem to think that it could. And I think it's important that we ask that question and that we consider what opportunities exist as a result of this kind of mass movement of people across the Earth's surface. So with the change in suitability mapped out across the Earth's surface below, and then as an overlay, we are showing the top 10 largest countries in the world by land area. And each country is represented by 2 circles. The black dashed line represents the land area, and the orange filled in circle represents the current population. And we start to see that Russia is by far the largest country by land area, with Canada as a second, and then United States and China closely behind. But Russia here is almost twice the size of Canada, making it far and away the largest land area in the world. But what both of these countries, especially Russia and Canada, expose is that much of that land area in the far reaches of the Northern Hemisphere, approaching the North Pole and the Arctic conditions, is going to see some improvement in the suitability for human life. And so both of these countries have started to recognize that this represents a major opportunity. Much of that land area currently is uninhabitable due to extreme cold, and much of that land may, in the near future, become newly inhabitable for the first time. And much of that land may also begin to become very good for agricultural activities, which means that both of these nations stand to gain in their role as producing the world's food supply, which is extremely important. But both of these nations, as you can see, have a much larger land area than population. In contrast, countries like India and China have a much higher population density with smaller land areas in comparison to the extremely large populations that they possess. But both of these countries are expected to experience a change in suitability for the negative and may likely be sources of displacement and migration. Whereas Russia and Canada, as they begin to need more people to take on the role of producing more food and expanded agricultural activity, will need to receive people. And both of these countries have started to recognize this, and some others are thinking about it this way as well. But Canada, for example, there's a group of elite business people that are currently lobbying the national government to make efforts to expand the Canadian population by 3 times the size in the next 80 years by the end of the century. So with a current population of 38 million, that would result in an overall population of over 100 million in just the next 80 years. And that's a recognition of these changing conditions and the important role that immigration can play in expanding a country's role in the world and their economy and position. And I think that really demonstrates the opportunity here. But how would that work? So currently, when we're dealing with refugees specifically, and these are refugees covered under the 1951 Convention, and there is a framework that was established within the past few years called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. And laid out in this framework are 3 solutions, 3 options to respond to displacement once it has occurred. So when there's an initial displacement event, you have a country of origin where conditions have forced people to leave for some reason, whether it's persecution or conflict or some other reason. And you have a group of people that are moving from that country of origin across an international boundary and arriving in another. So the country that they arrive in we'll call the country of first arrival. Upon arrival, they are most often placed within some confined conditions. Often that takes the place of a physical form of a refugee camp, um, symbolized here by the orange circle within the dashed lines. And they're often confined in other ways as well, though, beyond the physical confines of a camp or other system. They're also confined in the lack of ability to work, no legal work permits. They're also confined in their ability to move. They often cannot move freely within the country of first arrival. They are not often allowed to participate in the local economy or really create any kind of new life where they've arrived. And so once they're in that condition, they're entirely reliant on humanitarian aid, international support, and they often are in those conditions for many, many years. But how do we move people beyond that condition? So the first solution, as understood under the comprehensive framework, is voluntary repatriation. And this is considered the most important and positive and should be the prioritized solution. And it's really, though, not often possible. And voluntary repatriation is the return of those that have been displaced to their country of origin. But it's voluntary. It means that conditions need to have improved in the original country of origin for the return to be possible and desired. But also importantly, especially in the context of climate change, as we look at that now, is that these changes that have resulted in displacement are often not reversible. They are often continuing to worsen. And so in the case of environmental migration, when climate change creates the conditions to force displacement, those conditions are probably not going to improve. And so voluntary repatriation is unlikely to be a viable option for many of those displaced as a result. So the second option is within the country of first arrival, local integration. And this solution has gained some traction and positive feedback in recent years and is the option for those displaced to start to loosen the restrictions on freedom of movement, on freedom to work, on the right to work, on the right to even begin to naturalize into the country of first arrival and to become citizens, to become a part of the community and nation that they've arrived in. And this, though, really places a heavy burden on a certain specific group of countries. Most commonly, these are countries directly adjacent to the country of origin, so they are often geographically very isolated from the rest of the world. And it means that the distribution of this solution is really inequitable. So there's a third option, and that's resettlement. And resettlement takes those that have been displaced and redistributes them from the country of first arrival to another country, known as a third country. And these countries are often further away. They're often not directly adjacent. They often are in wealthier parts of the world, the Northern Hemisphere, Western Europe, North America. And this solution offers a lot of potential, but as it's currently used, of the three solutions, it's by far the smallest. So currently, the scale of third country resettlement remains minuscule when compared to the other solutions and to the need more broadly. Between 1959 and 2020, just under 4.4 million refugees have been resettled in third countries, which averages out to around 70,000 per year, which means that really less than 1% of the world's refugee population is resettled each year. So the scale of resettlement is clearly quite small. Of the total number, though, more than 60% have been resettled in just the United States alone, more than every other country combined, which shows that there's really not a wide adoption of this solution and that the United States has really been the leader in this solution. So here we have a chart that demonstrates that that role of the United States in resettlement, but also just the scale of it over the past 40 years, from 1982 to 2020. And the green line here represents the total resettlement, so peaking in 1990 and 2016 at over 150,000 people per year. But then at low points such as 2001 or 2020, we have 50,000 or less in 2020, which largely because of COVID, but important to note nonetheless. But when we look at the United States numbers, and you can see that the dashed line represents the ceiling, the cap set by the government, and the dark orange line represents the actual resettlement admissions, you can see that there is a strong correlation between resettlement and domestic politics. So in 2001, after the 9/11 terrorist attack on the US, you can see a dramatic decline in refugee resettlement just in that year alone. And then even more apparent is between 2016 and 2020, after the election of Donald Trump in 2016, is the sharpest decline in resettlement in the US in the history of the program. And at the same time, you can see that the rest of the international community actually responded by increasing the scale of resettlement. And so for the first time in the history of resettlement, the United States was not leading this work, and actually Canada took over as the leader of resettlement. And that's important, I think, because it begins to recognize the role that Canada sees immigration playing in its future. And what I think is important is the United States recognize the opportunity that it presents for it, that it takes some of the same position as Canada, and it returns to its history and its legacy of being a leader in this work, because at the moment, with declining birth rates and immigration rates combined with an aging population, the United States is facing an impending demographic crisis. Looking at the numbers, the United States is seeing an upward trajectory in overall deaths, while births are largely stagnating, and net migration is also stagnating. And that means that when we look at net migration rate and natural population growth rate, that both are declining simultaneously, but they are dropping to their lowest level in the history of the country. And that's really important because this trend has been fairly continuous since the middle of the 1900s, since around 1950, and is dropping to rates below 0.5%, which is pretty significant. So what does this mean for the overall population of the country? With growth between 1900 and 2010 fairly stable, and over the history of the world, of the country, its growth has been nonstop. The United States has grown essentially continuously from its beginning. But when we look at projections between 2010 and 2060, based on various immigration scenarios, and you can see that with zero immigration, if immigration were completely capped, the overall population would begin to decline by 2050, 2060. And that represents a real change for the country. And while that is not entirely likely, the purple here, which represents a low immigration rate, which is much more in line with current levels and the trends that we're seeing, and the overall population really begins to slow. And if that continues over a period of time, it could also very easily level off or begin to decline over time. What this chart shows, though, with the green, is that to continue the rate of population growth and the scale of the national growth over the past century would require a return to high immigration levels, the 447 million by 2060. That green line really represents a more optimal trajectory for the country. But given its long history as a nation of immigrants and its legacy as a leader in refugee resettlement, I believe that no country is better poised to meet these challenges by exploiting the potential advantages of environmental migration. The point being that environmental migration represents an opportunity to respond to these demographic challenges, these population trends. So to get a better understanding, though, of where any resettlement would or should occur within the United States within the context of climate change, we're going to take a closer look at the climate niche in relation to the United States specifically. So here we can see where the optimal conditions for human life are in relation to the United States. And it's largely concentrated within portion of the country that has seen the most population growth over the past 50 to 100 years, where many of the country's major cities are along the northeast corridor, much of the Sun Belt, the southeast, much of the key population centers along the west coast. And it does start to align with our understanding of where population growth is largely occurring within the United States. But when we begin to look at the change over time, by 2070, with even a subtle change in climate change, the suitability niche shifts pretty significantly, projecting it out to a more significant change, and it's moved further north. And with an RCP 8.5, the more dramatic projection, we can see that the area of the country that is best suited for human life has almost flipped. But what's really important to recognize here is that that portion of the country that is optimal for human life has not shrunk, it's actually grown. And though it has moved dramatically and shifted in what parts of the country will see improving conditions, it represents an opportunity for a large part of the country in terms of where growth may begin to shift to over the next 50 years. And so here we can see the change in suitability. And again, much of the southeast, much of the Sun Belt that is currently experiencing highest levels of growth, even parts of the northeast, parts of the west coast, will see an overall decline in suitability. But again, much of the northern half of the country and much of the Midwest, Great Plains, and Rocky Mountain regions will actually see an improvement. And so this opens up new areas for population growth across the country. But it's not just about the human climate niche, which is largely based off of a temperature analysis. But a more detailed analysis of climate change here can give us a more complete view of the situation and help us understand where in the country is best suited for population growth. So here we look specifically at the number of weeks per year above 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit between 2040 and 2060. And we can see that much of the southwest along the Mexican border is going to experience large numbers of days, a significant number of days per year with extremely high temperatures. Phoenix, Arizona, for example, which is one of the fastest growing and largest cities in the country, could experience up to 6 months of temperatures above these levels each year by 2060. That's half of every year, which is pretty significant. And if these trends continue, what we know is that there will be a greater reliance on mechanical, high energy consuming cooling mechanisms, which will only further contribute to climate change and create a worsening of the problem. But when we look at adding humidity to the picture, which is actually more critical to the effects of heat on human health, and we start to see that the effects are a little bit more distributed. Obviously, the biggest focus here of the challenge is really in the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Texas. But moving up the Mississippi River Valley, we can see that it reaches almost all the way up to the Great Lakes. And so the challenge really expands a bit further. But moving beyond temperature and humidity, we can see that the coasts are actually going to experience some real challenges of their own. And both coasts, the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States and the Gulf Coast along the Southeast, are really home to the largest portion of the American population. These are most of the major population centers. You have your LA and your San Francisco and your Seattle on the West Coast, and you have your New York and your Bostons and your Florida along the East Coast, and then much of the Gulf Coast with Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi all affected pretty significantly. And here you have the percentage of property below high tide by 2040 to 2060. And this means that there will be property damage, there will be people forced to move because the land that they currently inhabit will no longer be above water. As a result of these changes, by 2100, up to 2.4 million homes, home to nearly 5 million people, could all be affected. And for a reference, scale of reference, if this would be as if every house in both Los Angeles and Houston, two of the country's largest cities, were each affected. And that just shows the scale of effect and impact that rising sea level will have. But then we look to wildfires moving off of the coast, and we know that based on recent news that over the past few years that wildfires are becoming a bigger and bigger problem and affecting more and more people, resulting in annual displacement events just within the United States. And we can see that much of the western half of the country is going to experience some serious dangers as a result of expanding wildfires. So what's the good news? Because this paints kind of a concerning image of the future in the United States as a result of climate change. Well, when we begin to look at some of the effects of the shifting climate niche to the north, we can start to see some of the benefits. And here, though much of the South will see a decline in crop yields, for example, so we're looking at agricultural activities, a good portion of the northern half of the country, maybe even more, if we expand to the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains and parts of the upper Midwest and Northeast, we can see that crop yields are actually expanding. So while parts of Texas and Oklahoma may see crop yields drop by more than 70%, much of the upper Midwest could see as much as a 20% increase. And then when it comes to economic damage, again, we know along the Gulf Coast and the Southeast Coast and maybe parts of Arizona, we're going to see a serious impact of climate change on percentage GDP. But when we look at this across the rest of the country, we see large swaths that are in the green and moving into the blue. And this represents actually a net change for the positive in overall damage. And so these parts of the country may actually see benefits, economic benefits from changing climate. So where are these positive effects being felt most dramatically? Well, when we look at the climate niche and we look at these various other climate conditions, we can see that the benefits are really focused around the American Great Lakes region. So when we overlay the human climate niche with the Great Lakes Basin, which encompasses the 5 Great Lakes, we can see that there is a strong correlation between the two. And it's important to recognize that the Great Lakes together form one of the world's largest freshwater sources and represent approximately 20% of the Earth's total surface freshwater supply. This is an enormous resource and represents the kind of resilience that any place is going to need over the coming century as temperatures warm, as droughts increase. Access to fresh water is going to become one of the most critical and important components of any adaptation or mitigation efforts and in preserving human life on the planet. But what we also know is that this portion of the country is really the nation's industrial heartland and has steadily depopulated and deurbanized over the last 60 years as a result of deindustrialization. So to get a better understanding of this change, we look to the top 100 largest cities as of 1950 at the peak of industrialization in America, and we take a closer look at what the population changes have occurred in these cities over that period of time from 1950 to 2019. And we can see here that the cities in green represent the cities that have seen an overall growth in population during that time. And the cities in purple have seen a decline of 0 to 25%. And the cities in orange have seen a decline of over 25% population in that time. Each of the cities is represented by 2 circles. There's a black outline circle that represents the population at its peak in 1950, at the peak of industrialization. And you have a colored circle which represents the current population as of 2019. So we take a closer look at the green circles and the cities that have seen growth, and this is obviously the largest number of cities. It represents most of the cities where major growth has occurred over the past 50 years plus. And you can see your major cities in California, in Texas, in Florida, in the Northeast, but it's spread out pretty evenly. Then we look to cities that have seen a 0 to 25% decline in population, and this phenomenon is really isolated to the Northeast and the upper Midwest. And that's interesting for a number of reasons, but again is largely tied to deindustrialization. And then we move to the cities that have seen greater than a 25% decline in population, and again, largely concentrated to the Northeast, the upper Midwest, even though there are a few outliers. But what I think is really interesting is when we look at these cities that have seen a great decline in population in relation to the shifting of the human climate niche. Obviously, many of these cities lie outside of the current optimal conditions for human life within the country. But shifting forward to 2070, we can see that the vast majority, all but maybe 4 or 5 of these cities, will actually be situated really perfectly within the human climate niche at that point in time. And so I think this represents an opportunity. But what is this? How is this region currently understood? It's currently known as the Rust Belt because of this deindustrialization, because of these depopulation trends. And so we can see that this region, the Rust Belt here, marked out by the purple roughly, represents, again, a strong correlation between the shifting of the human climate niche in the future. And again, the Great Lakes region. Again, so the three really intersect in an interesting way. And so with improving climate conditions, this region is poised to once again become a hub of growth and development. I believe that this change is almost inevitable as the shifting of the human climate niche creates just the improved conditions in this region, but also has negative effects elsewhere that will simply result in people moving. And really, my thesis is based on the belief that cities have always been born of both migration and of refugees. And so there is no reason that those that have experienced a decline cannot be reborn of the same trends. So there's no reason that those cities, those legacy cities of the American Rust Belt, with declining population over the past 60 to 70 years, cannot be reborn and revitalized with migration and with the resettlement of refugees, or in this case, environmental migrants. So the proposal really envisions a climate haven in America's post-industrial cities. And a climate haven is really a portion of land or area that is poised to experience few disasters or risks as a result of climate change, but also either stable or improving conditions as a result of these changes. And as we can see from our analysis of climate change and the human climate niche, this area, these post-industrial cities, the Rust Belt, these cities are really poised to become climate havens. So through targeted resettlement and strategic investment, the region can be repopulated, revitalized, and subsequently reimagined as the Great Lakes Green Belt. And the idea here is really taking the idea of a green haven or a climate haven and expanding it to an entire region, looking at what is currently understood as the Rust Belt and reimagining it as a green belt, a green haven for reinvestment and revitalization and an overall repopulation. The result of this would be a vibrant and dynamic multicultural region characterized by economic growth, sustainable development, and the creation of a climate haven for both domestic and foreign environmental migrants alike. So here we have 16 cities that are selected based on the intersection of each of these analyses. So both the population decline of greater than 25% over the past 60 to 70 years, a strong position within the human climate niche, strong results from other climate conditions, and a position within both the Rust Belt and the Great Lakes region, and so a proximity to the important water resource that the Great Lakes represent. And here again, each of these cities is represented by 2 circles. The black outline represents the population at the city's largest, so at its peak, either in 1950 or 1960, and the orange represents the current population, which begins to demonstrate the scale of decline, but also the potential carrying capacity of each city. And so here, breaking each of those cities out individually, we look at the population in each between its peak and 2019, and we can start to see just the scale of change, but also the gap and the potential carrying capacity of each. So obviously the quintessential example is Detroit in Michigan. And here we have, from its peak in 1950, a population of over 1.8 million people down to, in 2019, a population of under 700,000, which represents a gap, a decline of over 1.1 million people, which is a huge number. And that's a decline of over 64%, 2/3 of the population has left in that period of time, which has created an immense negative effect on the city, but I believe represents an opportunity. What's really important to recognize with each of these declines in population is that the size of the city in land area, its overall boundary, has not shifted, has not decreased or declined, and so the overall size of each of these cities has remained largely stable, almost exactly the same as it was at its peak in 1950 or 1960, and since then has simply seen a decline in population density. The result being that the city is in charge of and responsible for managing the same land area, but with a dramatically reduced tax base, with an expanded number of vacant properties, with less people to do the work and to participate in the growth and expansion and ongoing revitalization of each of these places. So what is the scale of this when combined? When we look at each of these cities combined, at the peak, we had a population of over 10 million people, which is a fairly large number. But by 2019, the overall population of these 16 cities is down to under 6 million people, representing a gap of over 4 million people, a decline of 43%. And so here we really begin to understand the scale of the opportunity. And when we compare this to New York City, for example, or Los Angeles, which are the two largest cities in the country, and we can see that the 4.4 million is about a little less than half of the scale of New York City, but larger than Los Angeles, the second largest city in the country. And it really, we start to understand from this the scale of the opportunity. So embracing this opportunity would enable the United States to reverse current population trends, revitalize a struggling region, and establish itself as a world leader in responding to both climate change and environmental migration. And while the opportunity here is enormous, what I think is really important to recognize is that the reason that this kind of a solution is needed at the international level is that at this point, the international community has failed to come to any consensus on how to respond to environmental migration. Currently, the refugee framework does not include any protections for those displaced as a result of environmental changes, as a result of climate change, but already we understand that the largest percentage of displacement over the next 50 to 100 years will almost certainly be as a result, at least in part, of environmental changes. And right now, there's little consensus on how to respond or how to deal with this. And if the scale of change is anywhere near that's been projected, anywhere from 25 million to a billion people, the international community is just simply unprepared to respond. And so what this proposal really demonstrates is that those countries that are going to see improving climate conditions as a result of the shifting climate niche have not only a responsibility, but also a potential benefit that could be gained from taking on this challenge independently. And so countries like Russia, countries like China, that have already begun to recognize this, but then countries, more importantly, in the case of this proposal, like the United States, with a strong history of refugee resettlement and a history of immigration, I believe can begin to reframe this impending challenge as a real opportunity to respond to domestic population challenges and demographic challenges that threaten to undermine its position in the world. And so I think that this response represents a way to create and expand domestic support for this kind of a solution. While obviously domestic politics will always face challenges from those opposed to immigration, from nationalist sentiments, from xenophobic sentiments, when framed as an economic opportunity or an opportunity that helps maintain a position within the world, I believe that it could be reframed as an important step in the future of the country. And so with that, I will conclude. Thank you, and I wish you all the best.